There is something you do that you have never named out loud. You help someone, genuinely, practically, sometimes at real cost to yourself. And within hours, sometimes within minutes, a quiet accounting begins. Not deliberate, not conscious, but there it is. A small, precise awareness of what was given and what has not yet come back. You helped. They didn't notice the way you needed them to. And now something has shifted, almost imperceptibly, in how you look at them, in how available you'll make yourself next time, in how much of yourself you're already quietly withholding in advance. You didn't mean to keep score. You believe sincerely that you don't. But the ledger exists. You feel its weight most clearly in those moments when someone asks something of you and you say yes, while something underneath you says no. And you help anyway. And the helping feels like a debt going the wrong direction. This is not a story about ingratitude. It is not a story about selfish people extracting from generous ones. The other person in this situation is almost irrelevant. The mechanism operating here is entirely within you, and it has been running long before this specific relationship, this specific request, this specific moment of quiet resentment that you would be ashamed to admit you feel. What you have is not a generosity problem. What you have is a transaction that has been disguised, even from yourself, as care. Erich Fromm, writing in the mid-20th century about the pathologies of modern love, made a distinction that almost no one actually takes seriously, because to take it seriously is to look directly at something most people prefer to leave unnamed. He said that giving, in the genuinely loving sense, is not about sacrifice. It is an expression of aliveness, of what overflows from a full life. But the giving that most people perform is not this. It is giving as a strategy. It is giving as a bid. It is an offer of care that carries, beneath it, an unspoken negotiation. I give you this, and in return, you will be less likely to leave, less likely to withdraw your approval, less likely to see me as someone who doesn't matter. The transaction is real. You just never agreed to it consciously. Neither did they. And that asymmetry, the fact that you are operating inside a negotiation that only you can see, is the source of the resentment, not their ingratitude. Your contract. Most people who help compulsively describe themselves as givers. They have made an identity of it. They are the ones you can call, the ones who show up, the ones who ask how you're doing and mean it and remember the answer. And they are proud of this, genuinely, not falsely. But underneath the pride, if you press carefully enough, there is always the ledger. Not a written one, not even an acknowledged one, a felt one, a vague accumulating awareness of what has been given and not returned, of who has asked and who has offered without being asked, of which relationships feel balanced and which feel like slow drains. The giver will often say they don't expect anything in return. They will say it with complete sincerity. But watch what happens when nothing comes back. Watch the slow cooling, the slightly shorter responses. The way certain people get a less available version of the giver, week by week, without ever being told why. Because the giver is not doing it consciously, is not even aware of doing it, experiences it as a natural distancing from someone who turned out not to be the person they thought they were. The ledger isn't kept intentionally, it keeps itself. What makes this hard to see is that the behavior looks identical from the outside regardless of its source. A person helping from genuine care and a person helping from unconscious negotiation look the same at the moment of helping. The difference is only visible in what happens afterward, in whether the help depletes or replenishes the person giving it, in whether gratitude feels like a gift or a debt payment, in whether the relationship can withstand a refusal. The behavior I want to name, the one you've probably felt but never seen described precisely, is this. You give the help you wish someone would give you, and then you wait, without knowing you're waiting for the return that never comes in quite the right form. It is not that you help and secretly expect repayment. It is more precise than that. You help in the specific way that you need to be helped. You offer the attention you need to receive. You give the quality of presence you are starving for, and then you feel shortchanged when the other person doesn't give it back. Not because they're withholding it deliberately, but because they don't know you needed it. They thought you were just being kind. This is the gap. The ledger exists because one party knows the terms and the other party never agreed to them. There is something almost poignant about how precise the mismatch is. You are not angry that they gave you nothing. You are angry, though you won't call it anger, you'll call it distance or disappointment or a vague sense that this person isn't quite who you thought, that they didn't give you the specific thing. The exact form of recognition, of reciprocity, of noticing that would have settled the account. They may have given you a great deal. It didn't count. It wasn't in the right currency. And they have no idea what currency you're using because you never told them, because you didn't know yourself. If this channel is giving you something you haven't found elsewhere, subscribe. That's how this work reaches people who need it. What Fromm was pointing at when he distinguished genuine giving from strategic giving is not a moral distinction. It is a structural one. The person who gives from abundance is not a better person. They have simply resolved a prior problem that the strategic giver has not yet faced. The problem of what they need and where they actually get it, and whether they are willing to say so. The compulsive giver has not resolved this problem. Instead, they have found a workaround. They have learned, usually early, often in childhood, always in response to some emotional environment that made direct need feel dangerous, that care given is safer than care requested, that to offer is to be valuable, that to need is to be a burden, and so they offer constantly, and they call it generosity. And they are not lying. They believe it. But the need didn't disappear. It went underground, and it now runs as a parallel process beneath every act of care. I am giving you what I need. I hope you notice. I hope this makes you someone I can ask eventually when the time is right. The time is never right. Jung would have recognized this as a shadow dynamic, not the shadow in the popular sense of repressed violence or darkness, but in the more precise Jungian sense of the part of the self that has been made unacceptable, hidden from consciousness, and therefore projected outward and sought indirectly. The need for care in a person who learned that need is dangerous becomes shadow. It doesn't cease to exist. It operates from below the threshold of awareness. It drives behavior without being acknowledged. And so the giver gives, and the giver waits, and the giver resents, and never fully understands why, because the mechanism is invisible to them. This is not weakness. It is a form of intelligence operating in response to an earlier reality that no longer exists. The problem is that the mechanism doesn't know that the earlier reality is gone. It is still running the old program. The place this most commonly shows up, and the place people least expect to find it, is not in relationships marked by obvious imbalance. It is in the relationships that look healthy from the outside. The partnerships, the close friendships, the relationships where care is genuinely exchanged, where there is no villain, no parasite, no clear exploitation. Because the compulsive giver is not primarily attracted to people who take. They are attracted to situations where they can perform the transaction invisibly, where the giving can masquerade as love, where the negotiation can remain plausibly deniable even to themselves. The resentment that accumulates in these relationships is particularly bewildering because there is no one to blame. The person receiving the care did not ask to be overhelped. They did not request the quality of attention being lavished on them. They often do not even know it is happening at the level it is happening. They experience their friend or partner as generous, and they are grateful, and they say so. And it is not enough, not because their gratitude is insufficient, but because gratitude was never actually what was being sought. What was being sought was something more specific, something the other person cannot give because they don't know it's being asked for. Viktor Frankl wrote about the gap between stimulus and response, the space that exists in a psychologically developed person between what happens to them and what they do about it. What he meant was not mindfulness in the popular sense. He meant something more demanding, the capacity to notice your own impulse before it becomes action, to see the mechanism moving before you have already moved with it. The developed person does not experience less. They experience it and then pause. Between the feeling and the behavior, there is a moment of choice. That moment is what most people call freedom. The compulsive giver does not have access to that gap, specifically around care. When a need presents itself, someone struggling, someone asking, someone visible in their difficulty, the response is immediate, automatic, and experienced as coming from a genuinely good place. And it is, partly. But it is also a reflex, and reflexes, by definition, skip the gap. They move before the space between stimulus and response can be inhabited. The giver helps before they have asked whether this is help the other person needs or help the giver needs to provide. This is worth sitting with because it sounds subtle, and it is not. The difference between helping because someone needs it and helping because you need to give it is the difference between two entirely different acts that look identical from the outside. In the first case, you are responding to another person. In the second case, you are responding to yourself, using another person as the occasion. The other person's actual situation, what they need, whether they want what you're offering, whether your help helps, becomes secondary to the relief of giving it. You are not as present to them as you believe yourself to be. You are present to your own need to be the person who shows up. The cost of this, and there is always a cost, is not just the resentment. The resentment is a symptom. The cost is the progressive attrition of genuine relationship. Because when care is always on offer, freely and automatically, it becomes invisible. It becomes the condition of the relationship rather than an event within it. The other person stops receiving it as a gift because it is always there, like air. And the giver resents the very invisibility they have created, the invisibility that results inevitably from making themselves indispensable rather than present. The distinction is this: indispensable and present are not the same thing. You can be the person everyone calls and still be unknown to every one of them. You can be the most reliable figure in a dozen relationships and be genuinely close to none of them. Reliability, when it is a strategy rather than an expression, insulates. It creates the appearance of intimacy while maintaining a careful, unacknowledged distance. Because genuine proximity requires that you sometimes be a problem, that you sometimes need something, that you are sometimes for the other person work. The giver is never work. The giver is always the solution. And a person who is always the solution has made sure, without knowing it, that they will never have to be known. There is a complication here that most treatments of this topic skip, because facing it requires giving up a story that is very difficult to give up. The story is, I help people because I care about them. This story is not entirely false, but it functions as a cover, and the cover serves a specific purpose. As long as you believe your helping is primarily about them, you are protected from the more uncomfortable question, what does your helping do for you? Fromm's insight, the one that is most difficult to sit with, is that compulsive giving is not about the recipient at all. It is about the giver's relationship to their own anxiety. The person who helps constantly is not primarily responding to other people's needs. They are managing their own intolerable sense of what will happen if they stop. If they stop being useful, they might stop being loved. If they stop showing up, they might not be missed. If they stop giving, the relationships might reveal themselves to be thinner than they appear. The helping is a load-bearing wall. It cannot be removed without something collapsing. This is what Fromm meant when he described the necrophilous orientation of modern life, not death worship in the literal sense, but the tendency to relate to others as objects to be managed rather than beings to be encountered. The compulsive giver manages relationships through care. They maintain connection not through mutual exposure, the genuinely risky thing, but through service. And service, unlike presence, is controllable. You can modulate it, you can calibrate it, you can offer it or withhold it, and remain in the driver's seat. Presence, genuine emotional presence, with all the vulnerability that implies, cannot be controlled. And it is presence that the person receiving the care actually needs, even if they too have learned to accept service in its place. The terrible irony is that the relationship the giver is trying to preserve through constant care is the very relationship they prevent from forming through the same constant care. You cannot be close to someone who is always managing you. Proximity requires mutuality, and mutuality requires the giver to be, at least some of the time, a person with needs of their own, a person who can receive, who can ask, who can be inconvenient, who can be in the relationship as something other than its most reliable resource. Nietzsche identified ressentiment, a French term he used deliberately to distinguish it from ordinary anger, as the emotional posture of someone who has converted their powerlessness into a moral system. He was writing about political and cultural resentment, about the way people who cannot act on their desires will eventually reframe those desires as virtue. The person who cannot compete reframes competition as cruelty. The person who cannot take rewrites taking as corruption. The powerlessness gets laundered through moral language until it comes out looking like elevation. But the mechanism maps precisely onto what happens inside the compulsive giving structure. The giver cannot ask for what they need. Direct need feels too dangerous, too exposing, too likely to be met with a withdrawal of care that the whole system was built to prevent. So the desire for care gets converted. It becomes the desire to give care. The thing that cannot be received becomes the thing that is offered. And the powerlessness of that position, the fact that you are waiting always for something that you cannot ask for directly, generates a slow, acrid pressure that has no clean outlet. And here is where Nietzsche's analysis cuts most precisely. The giver does not experience their position as powerless. They experience it as virtuous. They are the generous one. They are the one who shows up, the one who gives without condition, who loves without limit, who is there when others are not. The identity of the selfless giver is not experienced as a mask. It is experienced as a self. And this is exactly what makes it so difficult to examine. The thing that is doing the most damage is wearing the face of the person's best quality. That pressure surfaces as resentment, not rage, not accusation, a quieter thing, a growing awareness that this person, for all they've been given, has not given back in the specific way you needed and could not say so. A withdrawal, gradual, of warmth that was never conditional in the way it turns out it was. A moment when you catch yourself calculating, with precision you didn't know you had, exactly what the ledger says. The most precise thing to say about this resentment is that it is not about the other person at all. It is about the accumulation of all the moments you chose the transaction over the risk. Every time you said yes when you meant no, you protected yourself from the exposure of refusal, the terrifying possibility that they would be disappointed in you, that they would need you less, that they would see you as less. And every time you protected yourself that way, you added a line to a ledger that they don't know exists, in a currency they never agreed to use. The resentment is the bill. The bill is yours. You wrote it. What would it mean to stop? This is the question most people jump to, and it is the wrong question first. Because stopping, simply stopping the behavior, withdrawing the care, refusing the transaction, without understanding what the transaction has been doing for you, without facing what drove it in the first place, is not resolution. It is substitution. You replace compulsive giving with controlled withholding and call it growth. But withholding from a position of unresolved need is not sovereignty. It is the same mechanism with the valence reversed. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the dichotomy of control, not as a technique for detachment, but as a practice of honest accounting. What is mine? What is not mine? The Stoic project was not to stop caring. It was to locate with precision what actually lies within the domain of the self versus what lies in the domain of other people's responses, choices, perceptions. The giver has collapsed this distinction entirely. They have made their own well-being contingent on something that exists entirely outside them. The quality and form of the other person's gratitude, recognition, love. And having made it contingent, they then experience the contingency as cruel, as something being withheld from them when it was never the other person's to give. What actually belongs to you in this dynamic is not the care you offer. It is the need beneath the care, the need for recognition, for reciprocity, for the specific quality of being seen that you have been trying to purchase through constant availability. That need is real. It is not pathological to have it. What is pathological is the delivery mechanism, the belief that giving enough will eventually produce it, that the right amount of care offered in the right way will eventually come back in the form you need. It will not. Not because the people you give to are incapable of loving you, but because what you need cannot be given in response to a transaction. It can only arise in a relationship where you have been, at some point, genuinely vulnerable, where you have been visible as someone who needs, not just someone who provides. Fromm said that love, not as sentiment but as orientation, as a practiced capacity, requires courage, not the courage to be kind, the courage to be known, to bring the needy, inconvenient, unsatisfied self into the relationship and see what survives. This is what the compulsive giver has never done, or has done once and been burned by, and has spent years armoring against with the steady accumulation of care that cannot be refused. The armoring makes sense. It was built in response to something real, but the armor has become the prison. And you are now resentful, quietly, precisely, shamefully, of the very people you invited to live in your care, because they have made themselves comfortable there without knowing they were supposed to notice how much it cost you. They were not supposed to notice. You never told them. This is not an accusation. It is a description of a trap so well constructed that the person inside it helped build the walls without knowing what they were building, and has been pressing against them without knowing that the structure can only be dismantled from inside, and only by the one who built it. The mechanism will not resolve when someone finally sees how much you've given. It will not resolve when a relationship becomes reciprocal enough that the ledger balances. It resolves, if it resolves, only when you become capable of being in a relationship without a ledger. When you can give from something that does not require return because it is not a negotiation. When you can need without disguising the need as generosity. When you can be present without managing the distance. That capability does not come from trying harder. It comes from looking directly at the thing you have been protecting, the specific fear that has been running the transaction all along, and staying with it long enough that it stops requiring constant management. Whether you are willing to do that is a question only you can answer, but the answer determines everything, not just what you give, but whether anything you give can actually be received.